Hello, everyone. Welcome to those in person and all the folks online. My name is Stuart Q. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, joint program of the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale School of Management. We have an author talk today that's a really special one for the people who've been around this institution for a while. So the first author talk we had at CBAE, since I've been here, was with Vincent Stanley and Yvonne Chenard a decade ago. And Vincent and Yvonne came here and spent 2 days, 3 days, just like spending time with every single group, person, small group, large group in and around campus, kind of sharing what they'd written and the parts of the book. And there was this wonderful joint degree student named John Lovner who was following around and actually went to almost every event. And at the end of it, he said, if you can ever build a relationship with Vincent Stanley and just make sure that he kind of continues to teach and engage with people on here, you've been incredibly successful in your role. And I would just like to share personally that like there are a few people in your life that you encounter who have a profound influence on you in terms of their character, the way that they approach decision-making, problem solving, the way that they bring out gently and in many ways the best out of other people. Vincent has been doing that on campus for over a decade here. He runs a program called the CBAE 2050 Fellows that works with people from across campus. He is a guide, an individual who deeply cares about the future of communities and the planet and this community. And you also see that reflected so many times when other people talk about when he's gone someplace and been somewhere and left an imprint there. So he's left a deep imprint on the people at CBAE, who he's been around for a long period of time. And we're just incredibly fortunate that he spent the decade here with us. He's joined and Zoe Chance, who is another author who we featured in this series, is going to be the moderator, leader for this talk. Zoe's well known around here from her course in Mastering Influence and Persuasion, and from all the ways that she supports and helps people as well. Thank you both for doing this. It means a lot to us. Your connection to the work here means a lot to us. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And it's just an honor and a delight to get to join you in this way. So Vincent had interviewed me when I got to do an author talk for my book a little while ago. And it's so fun to get to interview you and talk with you about this book. And when the original first edition had come out, this is a 10th anniversary edition, but it's not just a reprinting. It's very much an update with lots and lots of good stuff. So you'll be excited to read the book, even if you have read the original. I had read pieces of it. It's beautiful. I was excited about it, but I hadn't sat down to dig into it. And until I got the new version of The Future of the Responsible Company. And I loved reading this, and I want to go back and read it again at least 5 more times because it's such a pleasure and there's so much richness in it that I'm going to go back to it and go back to it. And part of this is because Patagonia is so inspiring, although the book is not just about Patagonia. But I'd like to open actually the floor to the audience, and can we just hear some concrete things, like actually anything that you already know about Patagonia, anything that the organization has done that's cool, big or small? Just raise your hand. Yes.
Warmwear program.
Let's say again.
Warmwear program.
Warmwear program. So what is that?
You can send if your gear gets ripped. I believe it's regardless if it's Patagonia gear, but especially if it's Patagonia gear, you can send it back in. They'll repair it.
So they'll fix your clothes. That's kind of crazy, right? Awesome. Thank you. What else? Yes.
I'm a former employee, and so I just know the employees are treated so incredibly well. Best job I ever had, most compassionate supervisors I've ever had. Just really proud to have been part of it for a time.
Amazing. What was something concrete that employees got to have as?
I mean, they have like the employee like return program for like the return clothes. And then also just we got a ski day that was paid for.
So return program is you can wear clothes and then just give them back?
It's like, yeah, it's like a little bit under ops, but yeah, like employees have access to clothes that have like been returned so that they don't just go to waste.
Amazing. And you get a ski day. Like once in your life, once in
No,
your
once a year.
once a year, you just get to leave and go skiing. That sounds pretty awesome. What else?
Patagonia Provisions.
What's Patagonia
It's-
provisions?
I think Patagonia's food line, which is really trying to sort of clean up for like unsustainable supply chains regarding food.
Raise your hand if you did not know Patagonia actually has a line of food as well. It's really interesting in here how Vincent and his co-author Yvonne describe the importance of making food sustainable. In comparison to you buy a jacket once a year or maybe once every 10 years and then you keep fixing it and recycling, but you have to eat food multiple times. Thank you. What else cool about Patagonia? Yes.
That's that with the Patagonia Provisions regenerative organic certification has been pretty cool. Just encouraging more companies to make regenerative, which is currently a really recognized form of agriculture.
That's awesome. And that's actually something that I learned for the first time from this book about the difference between regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture. But I guarantee you'll learn some cool stuff in here, even if you already know about that, which is awesome. What else? Two more things. Yes.
I believe I'm not quite sure on the exact structures of this trust, but I know it's like Patagonia, I think is essentially owned by like a nonprofit whose like goal is essentially to like dedicate themselves like for the planet.
So Patagonia has now given up owner, tell me if I'm saying this wrong, but given up an ownership stake to an entity that has as its mission benefiting the planet and the planet, which is one of the very first organizations in the world to do that. Yeah.
That's in Shed Ventures, which is their venture capital for socially responsible companies. Sorry.
They have food, they have venture capital, they have all of these different sustainability programs, and thank you. And you'll learn not just about, here's how Patagonia does some stuff that's cool, but what I loved about reading the story is that the way that I saw you as writing it is, let's change the way that we think about doing business, and we'll give you some examples of how we've done that, but it wasn't like, go ahead and copy what it is that we've done, but planting some seeds for thinking about how to do it. Vincent, tell me, so you are, among other things, the chief storyteller, you've been the chief storyteller at Patagonia. And when I first met you, I couldn't even believe that there's a really great and thriving and actually large organization who has a chief storyteller. And what is the importance of storytellers?
I think, let me know if this microphone is correctly positioned
Yeah.
in the back room. Now I will, let me just try to speak up. Can you hear me now? I think that to answer your question a little bit obliquely, Patagonia grew out of a climbing equipment company. And when I started actually in almost exactly 51 years ago, we had 10 employees and we were manufacturing climbing equipment that was sold all around the world. And I came in as a very young man. I was not yet 21, and I was vocationally a writer. But I was also a city person. I was not a climber or a surfer like all of the other employees there. But what I saw was that climbing makes a great story, because you have a challenge, you have an arc, you go up the mountain, you encounter future more challenges, and then you learn something, you change, and you come down. And I think this was kind of the basis for Patagonia's story. They had these really great stories on climbing. And then I think as time developed, and we started to, the first sort of moral act that Patagonia undertook was when it was still Chenard equipment. And it realized that the pitons, which were the absolute basis of the business, 70% of sales, were damaging the rock. Every time you hammered one of these iron spikes in, it expanded the crack. It was destroying the roots, the sport, but it was also desecrating the rock. And they made the decision, first of all, they went through the inquiry. Is there a way we can change this? Is there an alternative? And there was, because British climbers used another method of climbing that didn't involve hammering in an iron spike, but just a very gentle placement of a piece of aluminum that would hold under weight. And so the company made the decision to make the investment. It was so small at the time, $400,000 a year. It's huge to make the tools and dies that were necessary. And it changed the company absolutely, because they issued a catalog. And this was before my time. They had a 12-page article by a Sierra climber. It was part manifesto, why climbers should switch to this new method of climbing, and part user's manual, telling people how to use this new gear. And so what happened is that when I came to work in March of 1973, this catalog had been nine months out. And when the catalog was issued, as I mentioned, pitons had been about 70% of sales. By the time I came to work, chocks were 70% of sales. So that article had been read by every climber in the country, discussed in every climbing club and every magazine at the base of every climb. So that kind of taught us initially the value of telling a story, and not just a story, any kind of story, or any kind of fiction, or any kind of close to fiction about the wonderful qualities of your product, but a really basic, covering really a basic issue for climbers. What was the ethic? How do you create a good ethic around climbing? How do you do this responsibly? So anyway, I think that was the first time we discovered how important it was to talk to customers as friends and equals, and to tell a story based not just on marketing instinct, but on values.
Thank you. And I hope everyone in the audience can take away the seed that's been planted of, it's not enough to do the good work. In order to leverage and amplify and expand the benefit of that good work, we have to be able to share those stories. It's an integral part of the impact that we need. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about your origin story. So I'll share a little bit, and so that you get a flavor of the storytelling in this book, which I just love. A little addition to the origin story of Patagonia that you shared, and then we'll ask a personal one. Just so charming. You should know that at its beginning, Patagonia was meant to be an easy to milk cash cow, not a risk-taking, environment-obsessed, navel-gazing company. Yvonne created Patagonia as an offshoot of Chenard equipment for alpinists. And I'll skip this piece here because you've explained. Patagonia was intended to be a clean and easy company, desk jockey work, in contrast to the 10 hours a day of sweat and toil needed to hammer out pitons in a coal-fired forge or drill and cut chocks from extruded aluminum. The clothing business required no expensive dyes to amortize and had a much broader customer base than a few dirtbag climbers. Who knew then that cotton could be as filthy as coal? Our responsibilities as business people came slowly and almost involuntarily to light as we focused on the real work of designing, making, and selling our clothes. We did not set out to be a responsible company, but time after time, we stumbled into virtue after discovering we were causing harm. Can I hear about your entree into this world of environmentalism. So you start out as a city person, writer, hanging out with these climbers.
Yeah.
But you're very different now.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Yes, I grew up in the city. Ivan was my uncle. And so when I think I was 6 years old, he was making pecans in my grandparents' backyard in a converted chicken coop, and I helped him expand the walls by 10 feet. My earliest participation in the business. But he would show up, this is the late 1950s, he would show up with his friends and just sleep in the backyard. My cat would run away whenever he showed up with his friends because they had beards. He'd never seen a man with a beard in 1959 until my uncle showed up. So I came to work intending to stay for 6 months. I'd already co-edited a magazine on alternative education. I've been involved in an experimental high school. I came out of the Bay Area in the 60s. And so then I came down to Ventura, intending to work 6 months and go travel. And I just got really interested when we started the clothing business, which was the year I arrived. And what happened is that I didn't serve. So I was the only one to answer the phones when the waves were firing. And so I got tapped on the shoulder and said, well, you're sales manager now. And I said, what's that? It said, we don't know either, but you'll figure it out. So that was my entree into executive leadership. And that was the year we created the Patagonia name, placed the first orders in Hong Kong for Patagonia goods. And I just got engaged with this small business, this growing enterprise. I love the place because I came out of the counterculture and it was an anti-authoritarian spirit, but it was extraordinarily cooperative. The products, there was heavy concentration on creating high quality products. So I didn't know any better place to go at the time, and here I am. So that's the origin of my involvement. And over the years, as we discovered more and more about the environmental implications of what we made, but also in a way more importantly, the climbers and the surfers understood environmental degradation years before us desk jockeys did, because they were out in the Sierras where the sequoias were, 1,000-year-old sequoias were being killed by Los Angeles smog, climbing on Kilimanjaro where the glaciers were retreating, surfing in places that had been where the breaks were lost to development. So they saw this first, and I started to absorb it. I also did things like, for the first time, like cross-country ski, where my colleagues left me to die. And, to try climbing and ice climbing, and it eventually developed a really deep love of hiking in the mountains and sea climbing. So, and I think since the early 1990s, what's kept me at the company has been this engagement with environmentalism, but also social activism, changing the labor conditions in the supply chain. And with the prospect for changing the way we all make a living. There's this wonderful quote that I always use when I'm actually giving a talk, from Aldo Leopold, which is, a thing is right when it tends to preserve this integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And by biotic community, he means all of us, as well as the natural world, all its creatures and its plants. And yet everything we've done for a living for the past 250 years has tended to disrupt that integrity, stability, and beauty. And at the same time, we know that we are now existentially challenged by the implications of what we do. And it's time to figure out how to make a living and yet support life.
You're moving us in this direction, for me to ask, let's just make it explicit. In your perspective, what does it mean to be a responsible company?
Well, thank you for asking. One of the things we did with both books is we try to avoid what it means to me personally. I never liked the word sustainable as applied to a company, because I thought that there was nothing we did that was sustainable. But as we get into the food business,
Could you say more about that? Because that was really big.
Yeah.
Job.
because sustainability implies that you're actually repaying what you take. And we extract more from nature than we know how to give back. And almost everything Patagonia has done is to reduce the harm it does. Good to do. But you use that as a descriptor for a company, I think obscures, to use the word sustainable, obscures the reality of the situation. And so we like to use the word responsible because responsible is something we can all be. And we opened both books with a quote from Gerald Amos, who's a Haida leader in indigenous tribe in Vancouver Island. Says that the most important right we have is the right to be responsible, which I love because it's rather than look at responsibility as a burden, something you do when you're not having fun. It describes responsibility as central to human agency and to human fulfillment. And everyone can insist on that right, and every business can insist on that as well. So that's how we came up using that term. Now, the odd thing is that with provisions where we're actually building, if you use the right organic regenerative practices, you can rebuild topsoil. That takes nature centuries to develop just a few centimeters of topsoil. But by companion planting, crop rotation, minimal tillage, eschewing chemicals, you can actually build topsoil much faster than nature can. And to us, that is giving back to nature more than we're taking. So that becomes a regenerative way to do business that in effect is sustainable. In order to be sustainable, you have to be regenerative first.
I'm really mind blown by this idea that you have that there may, at least in the consumerist world we live in and the capitalist economic system that we have, that there may not be sustainable business models if we're being truthful about it. And I wasn't sold at first when I just saw the title of responsible company, like, okay. And then I started just asking myself and wanting to rethink. First of all, is it wrong for me to be using a frame of sustainability? And then secondly, what does the frame of responsibility open up? Like when you shared the story of the rocks, how many people or organizations would be thinking about the harm that they're causing to the rocks in rock climbing? And then so many examples here, like the situation where the company is growing and you get to have a new distribution center, wonderful. And then you're going out in Pennsylvania to be looking at fields and forests that can be raised to build a new distribution center and asking, okay, well, what would it look like to do this responsibly? And let's find a location, it doesn't have to be destroyed.
That's one of my favorite developments at Patagonia. Because I think for years, you know, the company has really evolved, especially since the 1990s, but even 15 years ago, I would describe separate subcultures at the company. The product people who were the go-getters, the tree hunters, working to change our practices and also give environmental grants. And then the bean counters, who were very conventional business people trying to watch everything and make sure we could stay in business. And what you described, we needed that. We outgrew our distribution center in Reno. And we were shipping all over the US from one location in the far west coast. So we started to look for a new warehouse. And we've sent our operations and our finance folks to drive around with real estate agents in Pennsylvania and Tennessee. Now, these are the bean counters. These are the logistics people. They're not the rabid environmentalists. And the real estate agents are cheerfully showing them raw farmland. And they're going back to the hotel at night saying, we can't do this.
The bean counters and
The bean counters, exactly, they had absorbed, there had been enough cultural absorption of all these three different groups that each of them could see the other's concern and own it. And so they partnered with an NGO in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. They had been working for 30 years to reclaim coal. There'd been a coal mining disaster in 1960 that destroyed 22 galleries of coals, flooded them through some illegal mining, and then wiped out the economy of the valley, and also wiped out the ecology. Anyway, we now have a distribution center on top, these 22 galleries of coal seams.
I love this. So Patagonia has the reputation rightfully of being an environmentally responsible organization. That's a lot of what we've heard, what we know about Patagonia. But you were talking about social responsibility to people also. Could you tell us more about that perspective?
I think that this is really a key question in our time, because over the past 25 or 30 years, the global economy is, because the world has become more politically unstable, the global economy is more in question, but it's still pervasive. What happens when you shut down a factory in Ohio and you move those jobs to China or Vietnam is that the people who are involved in making things become invisible. They're you no longer see, if they're suffering harm, that's no longer visible. And the nature of the deep supply chain, we had no idea what the conditions were in the factories. And we really had to undertake some work to do that. So beginning in the 1990s, we started partnering with organizations to audit conditions in the factories. We did that for 15 years and then thought, hey, we better audit conditions in the mills. Nobody has ever done that. We went into the mills in Taiwan and discovered that people were using indentured servitude labor. You know, they were the Taiwanese are prosperous, and they were importing people from the Philippines and Vietnam, and Thailand, holding their passports for 2 years, paying them almost nothing, charging them huge commission. So we went to the mills, we went to the Taiwanese government to try to eliminate this practice. But the more you uncover, the more you have to do in some ways. Even environmentally, I mean, we know that 97% of our environmental impact is in the supply chain, and almost 90% is in materials. So we've undertaken all these efforts. All of our nylon and polyester clothes are made out of 100% recycled synthetic. That's a big deal without sacrificing performance. It took us years to achieve that. Then we find out, okay, are we clean? Are we gonna be carbon neutral by 2028? No. And that's because the mills are mostly coal fired. So then we go in to talk to the mills and we work with them and try to start to talk to some of our competitors and other people in the industry. Is there a way, we're paying for audits, energy audits right now, with the goal to get them to transition to renewable from solar and wind and not make an intermediate transition to natural gas, but go right away to a source of energy that won't be abundant. But this is almost everything we do. We find that we take one step and then there's another step to be achieved.
Because what I am hearing and what I've been reading is that you keep stepping back to take responsibility for like the mills that you're talking about and the workers you're talking about. Those are not owned by Patagonia and they're not employed by Patagonia. Right?
They're not. But I think the other key element, and I think this is important for other businesses, is it has been possible to develop very deep partnerships with the suppliers who also have an interest in changing the practices. And the fact that they have a customer who's interested in this, who's not just saying, you know, cut my prices by 3% every 6 months, but saying, you know, how are we going to work together to make some improvements? When we made a switch to organic cotton, we couldn't, that was the first time we really learned how to make clothes, because before that, I mean, the first time I placed an order for Patagonia clothes was in Hong Kong. I handed them, you know, the spec sheets and the quantities. And when we ordered the cotton from the farmers, separated ourselves from the global supply chain, we had to figure out how to make clothes. And when we went to the spinners, they said, oh, we don't want to talk to you. We hate organic cotton. It gums up the machines. We don't have to. And we were really scared because we hadn't anticipated that. We finally found someone, one of the largest spinners in the world in Bangkok. He said, oh, let me try this. And he figured out a way to freeze the cotton before it went on the floor so that the aphids and all of the things that made it sticky wouldn't gum up the machines. And years later, we asked him, why did you even talk to us? We were so small, you were so big. And he said, well, I guess you could call me a closet environmentalist. And we found a lot of that.
Thank you. We're gonna open up to questions in a couple of minutes. I wanna ask you one more first, and also just note that the inspiring stories and concrete details will suck you in. And then when you want to be applying this kind of thinking to your own work, something I love, is the either least sexy or sexiest part of the whole book, which is the checklists in back. So checklists for more general advice about how to think through how could my organization be a more responsible organization in all of these different dimensions. And the question I want to ask you, Vincent, is especially for students who are graduating, going out into mostly companies who are not as responsible as we would hope that they would be. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that it's kind of a two-part question because there are limitations on the kinds of jobs you can get coming out of SOL. But I think that there are also very strong possibilities for the family over the next 10 or 15 years. And actually, my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 6, How to Make a Living in the Anthropocene, in which we really talk about ways there are all these avenues. You know, everybody's really familiar with electrifying the economy. Okay, that's clear. Regenerative organic agriculture is another area that needs policy work. It needs financing. It needs a whole transition to accepting smallholder farming on very different terms than has been seen in the last 40 years. But it also needs, on an industrial scale, the kind of circular economy work that is really significant, where one company's waste becomes another's feedstock. Marion Chartow, who's here, has done some of the pioneering work over the past decades that other people are drawing on. We talk about an example in Halifax, Nova Scotia, of 4 different companies, including a solid waste plant that can, next to the landfill, that can recycle 95% of solid waste into recyclable metals, into biomass pellets. So there are, I would look, you're looking for a job, but I would also look 10 years from now. Where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? What, in the first place, what kind of work do you love? That's really important. If you're, our bean counters, they're finance people, and it's wonderful that they're logisticians, and it's wonderful that they're doing the work they do, and they found a place in Patagonia. If that's the kind of thing you like to do, if you're oriented toward operations, if you're oriented toward finance, or like me, you're oriented toward storytelling, you want to look at that first, because most of the work you do is going to be chores. It's just the nature of things. And you want that 10% or 15% of the work you do that's going to be deeply satisfying to actually compensate for all of the blood and sweat you're putting into it. That's one thing, but the second part of the advice is to really look at, what do I want to be doing in the world? And remember that the world that feels so familiar today, and so as though it's going to continue unabated for 10 or 15 years, is going to change radically. And you have the capacity, you're being trained to be leaders. You have the capacity to open your imagination to look at what the challenges of the next 10 or 15 years are going to be, and figure out, what's my place in this? Where can I contribute?
Who else has a question?
Well, Vincent, first, thanks for coming. Big fan of everything you've said and written so far, but something that I've often thought when I'm thinking about Patagonia is just the growth it's gone through, going from a pecan maker to clothes, now food. And that growth has come with both organic growth and inorganic growth through acquisitions. Like Patagonia Provisions acquired an SOM founded company in Moonshot Foods a few years ago. And I've always wondered what that calculus for growth looks like from a Patagonia lens. So how do you decide that you're going to want to grow despite knowing that growth often comes with increasing environmental impact?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I think part of the reason we got into food was we did not want to be trapped into having to grow the clothing company beyond its capacity. We do look for organic, what we've called organic growth, but we don't advertise heavily. And we're really sensitive to that, but what you don't want to do is create artificial demand that then's going to drop off. And that creates a lot of instability for a business. That's when you get companies laying people off, because the sales go way up and then they go way down, or the margins go down because you're still trying to pump the sales. But it's a challenge for us also environmentally to grow and to reduce absolutely our environmental impact and not just proportionate to sales. I'm not sure that's an adequate answer, other than to say that the other thing that we really look at strongly is everything we get into the quality of what we produce is really important. So we do sacrifice, I don't know if sacrifice is the right word. We don't go after the sales of products that could make us more money in the short term, but they wouldn't last as long, and they would also reduce the value of the brand.
I know a lot of what you've said has been really focusing on the work that Patagonia has been doing, but more just in-house with respect to its own supply chain. But the problem is, Patagonia is perhaps the least problematic apparel company of all other apparel companies. How do you think about, using your own brand or using your own position as that sort of, really, I think, from like golden child to like bring others along within the apparel industry, bring others in the food business along with you, so that it's really an industry-wide change, because that's really what's needed at a global scale.
No, it's a great question. I think we helped start the Sustainable Apparel Coalition 12 years ago, and that has involved some successes and some failures. And the strength of the SAC, or now the Higg Index, is that it provides life cycle analyses to different companies, and it can go beyond apparel and footwear. So companies can share that. I mean, every LCA costs $40,000 or $50,000. Hard for smaller companies to pay for that. But I think more promising is the B Corp movement. And partly because the B Corp movement is really committed toward continuous improvement and reducing environmental impact and improving social performance. Because the companies are actually rated on a scale of 0 to 200. And it also, what we were kind of reluctant to become a B Corp initially, because we were submitting to so many audits, social audits, blue sign for chemicals and dyes processes. But what we found is it also provides us a community of other companies who are invested in living out their values as well as their business interests. So that, I think, is really important. And I think SOM still forgives part of your debt if you go to work for a B Corp.
And by the way, if you're gonna ask a question,
thank you so much for speaking to us. In a world that feels like there's so many different things that you could work on, and having seen a company that has successfully moved the needle on so many different issues, what was it that worked really well, and how ideas came up to the organization, how they were prioritized, and how it was actually done successfully?
It's just never easy. You really have to, and this is time consuming, because I think when you're doing work that hasn't been done before, you really have to look contextually at every situation. I mean, even if you consider, we have a very active in-house labor auditor. So you go into a factory and you find that they're using child labor. Well, the easiest thing to do is to withdraw from that factory. But then those families are without a living. So it's more complicated, but better to go in and say, how are we going to resolve this, and how are we going to take care of those people and stop using child labor? So I think there's always a temptation, especially now, to make every solution scalable. But when you do that, you also make the solution a little less intelligent. So, there's only so many hours in a day and so many people we have. But for the most part, I think we've spent a lot of time on trying to figure out the proper solution to each situation we have. Is that answering your?
Yeah.
I was talking to some people, I'm sorry, I was talking to some people from Singapore an SOM alumni and alumnus, and they were kind of asking me for kind of cookie cutter solutions. How do you deal with this situation? How do you deal with that? And I really couldn't provide an answer.
Question from the audience, that's online. David loves Patagonia, has been a customer since the mid-70s, there's a ton of Patagonia clothes. He's a little concerned though about like the use of plastics now, and although plastics are recycled, Patagonia clothing still releases microplastics and nanoplastics, and what is Patagonia trying to do to kind of mitigate this impact?
The problem Heather is describing is that if you wash a fleece jacket or a piece of underwear in your washing machine, it cannot capture entirely the microfiber waste. And then that goes into the municipal water system, and the filtration plant can't handle it either. Goes out into the ocean and ends up in the stomachs of shorebirds. So we've been working on this for about 10 years. Every piece of clothing generates microfiber waste, but it's a problem for plastics because they persist so long. One interesting development, you have to sort of work on all fronts. One is, how do you change the manufacture of the clothes to minimize that? How do we work with Ocean Wise in Vancouver, which is also looking at municipal water filtration systems. But Samsung has actually come out with a filter that will take care of 99% of the microfiber waste. And they're incorporating this into their washing machines, and other brands like LG and Miele have also looked at this. So I think that that'll be universal within a few years, but it's not the ultimate. The ultimate solution is probably at the source. So how do we change the way we construct it so we don't have that problem? The Samsung is another example of it, totally accidental. I was zooming in for a group of 200 vice presidents at Samsung, which is incomprehensible to us. And I was describing, I was trying to come up with, tell them, oh yeah, we have environmental problems too. And I was talking about this and said, no washing machine manufacturer will work with us on this. And then I said, oh, you make washing machines. Then I felt badly. I thought it felt rude. But a couple of the engineers in the room went to look.
When you just said a few moments ago that you felt sorry that you didn't have some cookie cutter solution to offer, I felt like a big message in this book is questioning whether there should be or whether we should expect cookie cutter solutions. Because almost all the examples are so context driven and the details matter so much. And part of what draws me along in the storytelling is that I might have had one perspective hearing what the situation is, and then you take me around a turn to think about it in a new way. Like, just as a small example, when there are employees in I think it's employees who are working in a factory that are getting headaches from the off-gassing of this material. And so the obvious solution is to install better ventilation. And the real much better solution is to go to the source and figure out what is the problem and what's the harm that we should be responsible for before even bringing this into the factory. And that's not something you could solve in a conversation with somebody, but you're inspiring people to ask these questions.
And I think it actually, I think that process is a good business solution. I think you have, this is how we went up down the path to making organic cotton clothes. This was a store actually we opened in Boston. And there was a problem in the ventilation system when we shut the store down and asked what was the agent that caused people to get sick. And said it was formaldehyde off-gassing from the cotton clothes stored in your basement. So going through that and coming up with a solution takes more time, but it works toward a more permanent solution than I think a lot of companies who don't want to take the time to do something, who then start hitting up their suppliers to, to reduce their costs without addressing some of the things that create those costs.
So as many of us approach graduation, we kind of have a choice if we want to do this type of work. We can work for a Patagonia of the world, or we can work for, choose your favorite, not Patagonia of the world. And when I think about responsibility, there can sort of be the highest quality of responsibility or the highest sum total of responsibility I can enact in the world. And it feels like there is really hard trade-offs that I struggle with to decide, do I go to a company that doesn't fully align with my values, but can do more good at scale, or one where I really like everything they're doing and I can contribute just a tiny bit more. How do you think about that trade-off as you are talking to a group of students that might be trying to decide which path to take next?
I think my basic advice is to do something to work for a company with values as close to yours as possible. But there's also an educational component in going to work for a company that does things that you might find interesting, where you might learn. There's a great, Hemingway used to advise, Ernest Hemingway used to advise writers. He said, go to work as a journalist, but don't stay too long. And that's generally been my advice to people who go to work for McKinsey or someplace. And I think actually going to work for a company where you think you can do something at scale, but if they're not doing something interesting or tending that way, you're not going to have the influence that you need going in. I mean, if you find yourself working for a company like that, there are little tips in the book on how to make a difference. But I would move. I think there are enough companies now. I would try and, depending on whether your operations, finance, or marketing, and what your interest in the world is. You want to make shoes? Do you want to go into finance? Those are also questions. But you can find a company closer than what we all think of as not so big companies.
I love the question, and it's relevant for many of the people in the room. And what I hear you saying, Vincent, is questioning. So you're asking Lauren about values alignment versus scale. And that what you're saying is, don't assume that you can impact that company that has the scale. You might or might not be able to, and it's going to really depend. So if you want to know what impact you have, it's really going to be context dependent about that, either of the two organizations. Yeah.
You don't want to have a mortgage yet while you're working. We'll talk about that tomorrow in 2050 fellows.
Don't leave yet, because we have another specific announcement at the end, but coming back to writing, I have, just as we walked into the room, asked Vincent if he would read one of his poems for us. Vincent is a novelist and a poet as well. He's been published in Best American Poetry, and I brought this one that I love.
Which I don't know how you found. Well, thank you for that. And thank you all for coming. Easter Sunday. Who flung the mustard pot, stained the hills a gingered sun? Who gave spring its only name? Who made the roll of hills a flank and inked in the brown black of cow, who raised its lowing head? Or carved into the cliff the whistle of the train, or invoked 7 fish in a bouillabaisse as Mediterranean, or choreographed the tips of the grass? Who took the sting out of the breeze or let linger the nose of wine at the table after we sobered? Who etched those lines in our faces, softened our flesh, our sorrows? Was it being or being back of that? Or life in its instance, as in the upward wheel of the white egret, its beat of hesitation before wings unfurl in the push from green to blue, and the buoying as our bright afternoon abloom lifted us, old friends enough for long enough.
Thank you. So beautiful. Thank you for coming. Before you go, Heather and Stu and the Seabay crew has books for most of you. I invite you to receive this gift responsibly, which means it actually, when you receive it, it entails a responsibility to read it and an invitation to re-gift it if you are willing to let go of it afterward. And Vincent will be out here at the table where he'll be able to sign some books for people who are super passionate to have that happen. Thank you for coming.